So what is your strength profile or force profile in the hack squat? Well, here I am trying to predict that by measuring my maximal isometric for 3 seconds at the bottom position and then moving up incrementally in 4 positions to the top position of the hack squat to get an idea. The purpose of this was to be able to look at the magnitude difference between using a reverse band versus no band and seeing how that would apply to the theory that the lengthened position is more beneficial for hypertrophy, looking at how much of the lengthened position is being loaded or deloaded with the reverse band versus how much are we just matching the strength profile better so that we're actually getting more loading during the lengthened portion, especially if we're looking at the bottom 25% or bottom 50% of a hack squat. So here's an example of what the data looks like from one of those isometrics. What we have here is we have a high initial peak, and this is where basically that tension hits, where take out the slack and hit. So there is some momentum factored into this first point here. And so what I did is I collected the data in 3 different ways. One is looking at this first peak to the second peak, and you'll see that represented in white, and then I averaged those, and so that was one data point that I tracked. The next data point that I tracked was eliminating this initial peak so that we could, remove the momentum factor from the equation and just look at that sustained contact with the machine over the first second, which was about 3 peaks. So I basically did 3 peaks, so pretty close to 1 second of tension, and then we took the average there, and you'll see that represented in red across the graphs. And then the other one was that whole 3-second, contact isometric and averaging across the entire 3 seconds to account for the bit of fatigue that would occur there as well. And then we would average that, and you'll see that represented in yellow. So when we look at how those trended, you'll see that the white sat above, especially down in the bottom portions. And as the resistance got heavier, because what I had to do in this experiment is I had to actually increase the load on the machine so that I wouldn't exceed the amount of force that my gauge could tolerate or that the daisy chains or whatever could tolerate. So I had to use an increasing mass as I started to go up. And what you'll notice is that as I started to increase that mass, that decreased my ability to generate the momentum, and the white line comes in and it trends closer to the other 2 lines that aren't as subject to momentum. The other thing is like with this point here, I'll just point out that like in this position, I had the greatest distance to be able to generate a little bit of momentum between where I had to lift the weight off and where the slack actually came out. So that's probably why this point sits just a little bit higher. But overall, if you look at this trend as a whole, they all trend very similar, and you'll see that the two things that didn't include momentum, the red line and the yellow line here, trend almost parallel to each other. So that's the 1 second versus the 3 second, and it's exactly what we would expect. The 3 second is a little bit less because obviously you're going to fatigue a little bit over the 3 seconds, and your second 2 seconds shouldn't be as much force as your first second of a maximal contraction. So this scale here, this is going from 0 to 1,100 pounds. If we then take and we apply the resistance profile in green here of a 4-rep reverse band, right? So basically, just from a profile perspective, this is the trend line of my actual, like the way that I actually do the reverse band measured. So this is the amount of band tension to the amount of load that I used. I don't have a 1-rep max. I mean, a 1-rep max would have been the best thing to put across here, but the only data that I have that's close enough would be my top 4-rep max, right? And so that's what this is. So this is the actual amount of load that I can use at the bottom of that calculated, and then what the load would be at the top for all of these positions in terms of the resistance curve provided by my reverse banded hack. Now, you can see that the line doesn't increase as much, and the big thing is just look at the distance there is at the top position, right? And then basically like look at how much it spreads out from the top half. Like, so the space between here means that my force capacity, like the strength that I have, is far exceeding what the resistance is in a banded hack squat here, meaning I can produce way more force. So the odds that I'm building up a ton of fatigue by this tiny little bit of resistance that increases over this position right here, when I have this huge excess of strength, it's going to be a very, very minimal amount of fatigue, right? Increase. So let's zoom in to give that a little bit more perspective. So what I've done here is I've brought it to, 500 pounds at the top, 300, so that we can really just kind of see this difference zoomed in. So, and what you'll see here is now that you can see that reverse band line is trending really close, like almost parallel to what I have here in terms of my strength curve, right? So the resistance curve is almost perfectly matched, right, in terms of the amount that it's going up compared to what my strength goes up in that first portion. So basically, instead of only being able to get the maximum amount of tension in the muscle at the very bottom position, now I'm basically able to use maximal effort or require maximal amount of recruitment in the whole time between the bottom position and the 1-up position. And then by the time we get to the 2-up position, which is about mid-range here, right? So if we look at these, bottom position, that's my full knee flexion. That's hams on calves that will not go any lower. 1-up, right? So this is below 90 degrees. 2-up, so right here, this mid position, this is about a 90-degree knee bend, and then we're getting closer and closer to knee extension as we go to the 3-up and the 4-up, right? And in the 4-up, like if anything, I'm underestimating the amount of tension here because I was actually able to stretch out the daisy chain a bit, and so it looks like I'm almost like straight knees here, and that's because what happened is that the position that I had it set in, I was actually able to stretch out the mechanical stuff that I was using to try and measure. So like basically the amount of force I could produce is in excess of what probably I was able to measure here. But that's irrelevant because it's off the charts anyway, right? Like, so the big thing is that we're looking at this is like the distance is becoming so big here, right? I mean, so this is essentially like, something around, I don't know, like a 600-pound excess, and strength at this point. And, and here, if we're looking at this, so it's like, okay, it's a 200-ish pound excess here. So obviously it's like the amount of effort that it takes to do the rep here from, even if you're using a reverse band, is relatively small. The amount of fatigue is going to be relatively small when we're looking at the difference here, right? So, but you can see that this pink line here, which is now representative of using no band, but setting it so that you're using the same weight, which is going to be pretty close. Like in practice, and from what I can work around with numbers, is basically the amount of weight that I can use in the bottom position with a reverse band versus no banding is very, very close to the same, right? Like very close. Now, as you go into higher reps, and this is something I've done, as I go into higher reps, that will change. But if I'm 10 and under per se, the difference between the amount of load that I can have in the very bottom position, reverse banded or not banded, becomes very, very close to the same. Because if you look at this is a 4-rep max for me, right? And these lines here represent like my, what would be the maximum amount of tension that I could provide. Granted, these aren't on the same day, so there could be a small fluctuation or whatever. But like, there's not a huge difference in pounds here. Like, I can't remember the exact data point here. I think I have them on here. Yeah, something like this. So if we're looking here, so like I'm using 94% of my 1RM. Like if I use the red line here as my marker here for a 4-rep reverse band. So, I mean, that's if you did the math, if you use one of those formulas, it would say that I'm using more than I should be able to use if I was doing a 4-rep, if you use like a 1-rep max calculator. And again, these aren't on the same day, so who knows? Maybe I was just having a rock star workout on that day that I did the 4-rep reverse band compared to this day. I'm okay with that. But, okay with having that scrutiny in there, right? But the point is that like it's not going to change that much. So I did this green set about 4 weeks before I did this experiment here where I measured the maximal isometrics, and I did have a little bit of a deload and break in there. So yeah, sure, like maybe this green line or maybe this red line would be a few pounds, maybe it'd be 20 pounds higher or something like that, or closer to what would actually been. But the point is that I'm able to use pretty much still the maximum amount of load that I could tolerate in the very bottom position. But with the reverse band is I'm able to then match the strength profile with that resistance going from the bottom up to this 1-up position, and then we start to see that separation as I get towards the 90-degree position, and then from there that's when it really starts to separate. But the reason I zoomed in a little bit further to just the bottom to 90 degrees position, so essentially the bottom half of the rep, is to show that at this point in time, I'm still my resistance curve is still 80% matched to the force curve, and it started at 94%. So that means it's a 14% drop when I'm using the reverse band, right? And at a 14% drop over half the rep, I'd say this is still a pretty significant amount of tension. This is definitely this is only a 1% drop going from the bottom to one up. This is a significant amount of tension still. So if we're looking at, stimulus, obviously you got to take in all the factors of all right, we got to be getting, close enough to failure and volume and all those other things. But if we're just applying this to saying well, all those other things are good enough and equal compared to these examples, is there's only a 1% drop in the resistance curve compared to the strength curve here for me in the bottom quarter of the rep here, whereas as I'm going from 94 to 85%, so a 9% drop if I wasn't using a reverse band. So 9 times the difference in the bottom quarter of the rep using the reverse band versus not, right? And then when we extend that out, I'm getting 80% here and 67% here, right? So I'm looking at essentially, almost like the drop is at this point almost twice as much without using a band versus using a band in terms of how close it is to what my actual strength profile would be. So I would say, with the reverse band here and the whole bottom, I would say at 80%, okay, keep in mind we started at 94, right? So at 80%, if this was really if this was actually 100%, right, then this would be, then this would be 86% or something like that, is what we would expect that line to be. If I had a 1 RM to a 1 RM or a 4 rep max isometric versus a 4 reps, whatever. But we just can't feasibly measure that, so we're working with best we have. But I would say this amount of force match here means that I'm still getting significant tension through basically the whole bottom of the rep. Okay, and then if we look back one, right, and we look at what's happening from the two, I would say at this point in time, that's where we see this separation basically increase exponentially. In neither of these cases am I getting a ton of resistance in the top half of the rep. But with using the reverse band, I'm able to get more significant tension, I would say, in the bottom half of the rep than using no band at all, represented here in the pink, and I'm already down to 67% match at the bottom. Now, you're still going to get the benefit of what the load in the bottom. If you're trying to move the load faster, then you're the fact that you're trying to overcome or add momentum and overcome the inertia, that's where it's just your intent could bring this pink line up a little bit initially, but then because of the momentum, it would then drop off a little bit. So potentially you could, through intent, make this pink line come up and then come back down, but you could apply that same thing to the reverse band. So because those things could be equally applied intent-wise to either scenario, basically we could apply those to both, except the band is actually going to allow you to take advantage of that more because it's going to buffer out and reduce the amount of momentum that you could create, which would make you match the strength curve for a longer duration or a higher percentage of that total range of motion. So again, what we're looking at here is we're looking at the difference between my strength curve and in the red versus the green line, the resistance profile that I'm using for a 4 rep reverse band versus what I would use with no band here, and showing that you're just able to make that match a little bit closer, right? And so that means that if we think that, this part of the range of motion is still stimulatory to hypertrophy in this part of it, which means that it's not that only the bottom position matters for stimulating hypertrophy, but we get benefit as we go towards the lengthened position, and it probably starts at about the lengthened half, and the big benefit is probably something the lengthened third, so from here over. Well, what I would want is I would want to have the resistance be as adequate and matched as possible during that portion there, right? So that I could really take advantage of loading that whole portion versus having a resistance that was only hard at the very stretch position and then got easy too fast, and I didn't quite get enough benefit, or I didn't get as optimal benefit as I could. So to sum this up and recap for you guys, essentially what I'm showing here is that my ability to load my quads in the very bottom position is essentially equal with a reverse band versus no band, green versus pink here. And as we go up to the 25% marker, I'm able to significantly load my quads more using a reverse banded strategy than no band. It's likely still somewhat adequate stimulus, with no band at 85% force here, whatever. But by the time we get to like the half portion of the rep, we're definitely not getting any much productive resistance if we don't do any sort of banding here. Whereas I'm still getting a significant amount of force requirement with doing a reverse band here in the whole bottom half. So the lengthened half, I'm getting much more tension, much more force requirement, much more load in my quads from the reverse banding, specifically the bottom 25%, really, really closely matching the resistance profile to the strength curve there. And then from the argument that like, all right, am I going to be producing more fatigue if I use the band because of the extra load at the top position? What we can see here is that basically once we get into the top half of the motion is that the strength capacity of your quads in the hack squat, like just the your ability to load the levers at that point in time because the joints are starting to stack, is so efficient that you're working at such an insignificant capacity of your strength that whatever fatigue that you're getting here in the top half of the range of motion is likely going to be very, very minimal. And it's likely not going to offset the benefit that you're getting from a better, more efficient loading of the quads in the bottom half position, right? Because here, these lines are, they're fairly close together. If we zoom out again, you can see that, look how close these lines are here in the bottom quarter percentage versus the bottom half, and then look how much they separate here, right? So the ability to keep this profile really well loaded in the bottom half of the position probably far, at least in my assessment here, far outweighs whatever extra fatigue you'd be getting out here, because it's just going to be so minimal because you're so much stronger than the amount of resistance that the band is increasing once you get to that top half of the range, because your levers are straightening out, your strength capacity just goes up, your force capacity just goes up so much more than the band that the increased band loading becomes insignificant once you get up in the top half or past 90 degrees of knee extension in this case. So that's where it's like from an efficiency standpoint, especially if we're talking like under 12 reps, that I think that, using the reverse band here is more efficient on a per rep, per set basis for loading the quads and getting stimulus in the bottom half of the position still, even though it's deloading that bottom half of the position a little bit respectively to the top. It's doing it in a way that actually gets us closer to matching our strength curve, which especially in this bottom position here should allow us to get more stimulus out of the whole bottom position, right? The whole bottom quarter, the whole bottom half, which, I'm looking at the hypertrophy data on lengthened position. It doesn't seem to say that it's only the very, very bottom that matters. It seems to be a continuum, meaning that if we're on the bottom half or the lengthened half or the lengthened third, that's where we really want to be. And we want to be taking advantage of like this whole area here, right? Not just this one spot here. At least that's my assessment of what we have in the research, and also my assessment of what I've seen, practically, coaching people and programming, etc. So there you go.